Welcome to Common Ground Discourse, everyone. We're your co-hosts. My name is Shane Swor.
God's peace. I'm Brother Kenneth Hosley.
So we are continuing our conversation on guns in schools, gun violence in schools. And the topic that we're focusing on now is the student response to what it is to arm a teacher. And so, again, Kenneth is a teacher in the Metro Atlanta area, and he has an interesting set of feedback from how the students feel about putting guns in the hands of teachers. So, Kenneth, I'd like for you to take over and let us know what were your findings when you engage these conversations.
Sure. As I mentioned in the other segment, when I was preaching the Sunday immediately after the events at Parkland, a parishioner there asked, what were your students' response to this? And keep in mind that my students are Metro Atlanta, predominantly African-American school. The next largest minority is Latinx students. And this is what makes up our school. Very different from the suburban schools that you see in the news. And when that parishioner asked me, it took me a moment because it occurred to me my students didn't have much of a response in the immediate events afterward.
Interesting.
While everyone else was glued to the news and how could this happen, how could this happen, my students are used to it. And that's what disturbed me. After preaching that Sunday, I went back and I specifically asked my students, what do y'all think about this? And relating to them the conversation I had with that parishioner. And my students' responses varied. And this is the glimpse I would like our listeners to have, because this is the part of the big conversation in the media that I think is missing. With the exception of the survivors from Parkland, very few students are in this conversation. We hear a lot of politicians, we hear teachers, and we hear parents. But no one's asking the students that much, how do you feel about having an armed teacher in your school?
Right.
My students' immediate response just to the events in Parkland were striking, if not distressing to me, as symptomatic of how our society has gone. They said, well, first off, if that ever happened at our school, clearly they'd just come in and they'd start shooting kids. So my students, my black students, feel that that is the typical response to their school. Rather than being controlled and pulling people out, they're just going to go in and shoot and don't care if other black students are killed.
They being is law enforcement?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Those who are
Right.
Okay.
And further, they saw pictures of them being escorted out, and one student remarked, they wouldn't do that to us. They tell us to get on the ground, put our hands down there, and treat us like criminals, like we're all the shooters. This is what they expect. And I encourage our listeners, especially those that are white, with our implicit advantage, not to get defensive of this, not to try to justify or correct a student, saying, oh, I can't believe they believe that. They just don't understand. No, these students do understand. This is the legitimate reaction. You don't get to discredit their honest reaction. It is what it is.
For sure.
And the one that really drove home is when one of the students said, I feel really upset, or they were really upset, because they just said as soon as they got him, because he looks white, it must be mental illness. If a black student had done that, they would have found him in the neighborhood, killed him, and then kept shooting him again. That's what they expect to happen, rather than a white shooter being peacefully taken and protected as they're taking into the courtroom.
What kind of just for our listeners, what kind of examples can you draw into this? Because, obviously expectations and how these students are thinking are important, but when we look at examples, what leads them to think that this would be the case? Just to ask that question.
Sure.
What examples can we look at?
Yeah, so for our students, there's been so much in the media in the past year plus with the Black Lives Matter movement that comes out of police brutality. So they have been seeing in the news and in their own communities where police are more willing, they look at the statistics, police are more willing to kill black, especially men, and use lethal force for lesser transgressions than they do with white criminals.
And that, do you think that would bleed into how they would respond to a school environment?
I absolutely believe so. Our teachers, the law enforcement rather, our law enforcement, when they come to the school, the fact that we are more prone to take a black teenager and try them as an adult as opposed to white teenagers that are still tried as juvenile. The law enforcement system we have, by that alone, shows that they are willing to hold a black teenager more accountable, as it were, and therefore justify greater force.
Well, I think what's important here to note is that the reaction that your students had, in that they don't feel confident that law enforcement would be much help in the situation. So now we look at the response to arming teachers. What did you get from that? What were they saying?
So I took the opportunity, since I have a captive audience, if you will, of my students. I gave them a writing assignment, and they're supposed to give me a whopping 4 sentences. And the prompt was, do you feel teachers should be armed in classes? Why or why not?
Right.
Specifically around this issue, they knew where it was coming from. And the responses I got back, and these are what I want to share with our listeners verbatim from their responses. This is what my students are thinking. When asked, do you want an armed teacher in your school? This is immediately what it gave me. And to give you perspective, getting my students to do this subjective response, which I do on a weekly basis, they will struggle to give me 4 sentences because they don't like writing.
Right.
The papers I got back this week are covered into the margins with their responses.
And just for the listeners, I'm looking at these papers now, and the scripture goes beyond the boxes, the writing area that they were given. They didn't care about these boundaries on the page. It is a full page of just thoughts from these students recorded. So please share.
Yeah, so these are verbatim responses from my students, and these are high school students, 10th and 11th grade, from a metro Atlanta school, and they're responding to whether or not teachers should have guns. So one student says, I do think that there are a lot of good and bad factors to teachers having guns. However, most of those factors lead to bad outcomes. If teachers have proper training and background checks, things could be better. However, things could go sour for everyone. If a teacher has a bad day, they could possibly get angry enough to be violent to the students. Another student responded, the idea that teachers now be armed with concealed weapons on campus is a bad one. It's nice to think that if something bad were to happen, teachers would be there to protect us. However, I feel that some teachers would use it on students. Students have grown to be very disrespectful to authority. I always see students yelling at teachers and vice versa. Though none have ever gotten physical, there are videos online in which this occurs. I feel that some teachers would use this on students when they snap. Another student said, I do not believe this is a good idea at all. As a student, I would not feel safe inside of a classroom with a gun. Having a gun inside of the class would throw off the concentration of the whole classroom. We also have no idea if the teacher is mentally stable. One bad day on the teacher's end and the whole school could lose their lives. I also believe that I attend a school that is filled with reckless children. An argument could spark between the teachers and student, which could lead to the student taking the gun out of anger and shooting the teacher. Another situation like Parkland can happen, and it would be unsafe for a teacher to just shoot into a crowd of students. The first thought would be that this is a safe idea. However, this could end the lives of many more people. And the responses go on and on. But what the general comments that I got, if I were to sum them up, one, they are concerned that other students would now have their hands on the guns.
Right.
That because you have brought guns onto campus, those students that would use guns now have access to them. The second is that they are concerned with the stability of the teachers, the emotional, psychological stability of the teachers that now have these guns.
It's a valid concern.
Absolutely. And as one of my students said, these are tough schools. And I know that we have teachers, I will be frank, that I have colleagues I would not want having guns in their hands. And we are human beings, and we have so many instances of police officers and soldiers, because they are human, that misuse guns when they are given the chance.
And these are the individuals that train on a daily basis.
Exactly.
Now we're expecting teachers.
Right.
And that's not even 5% of their daily focus, and expecting them to perform, as you've said recently, to perform like action heroes. It's not realistic.
It can't be realistic to think that they will stop being human. And that these humans have faults, and they will have bad days, as my student says.
Yeah.
And we are put in very difficult situations with very difficult kids. I have students that confront me physically. That's how they've learned to react to authority. That they stand up to me, pose as though they're going to fight. They give the visage of physical threat. And if a teacher is untrained or is scared in these situations, then if they have the weapon on them and they have been pushed too far because they are human, you have now put a variable into this that can make a situation which would have been bad. Sure, there might be physical confrontation. There might be verbal and emotional confrontations that go through this and abuse. But you've at least limited the damage that will come from this.
Yeah, well, you make a good point. I'd like to interject here. Yeah. In a segment called The Riddle of the Gun, there is a realization that if you have access to something, you are more apt to use it, even if it's unnecessary, even if that force is...
And this is from Sam Harris.
Yeah, it's still Sam. And so I keep bringing him up because he's written a wonderful piece on this that I value, because it's completely bipartisan. It's not left-leaning. Well, it's left-leaning, but he introduces a lot of right concept. Not to sew in the political stance here, but 90% of this is political, right? So, but just having the presence of a tool that can ultimately allow you to reach your goal, even though it can be perhaps not something that is well thought out. You want to end a confrontation, you want to end, or you want to mitigate perhaps violence to yourself, harm to yourself. If you didn't have the gun, you would think about other things, other options. But if you have a gun, now your mind is fixed on using it because it's there.
Right.
So,
and we can't use the excuse that, teachers will be trained.
No, you can't.
Because as we said, you have police officers and soldiers that have been trained, and far more extensively than they're suggesting for teachers. Yeah. That even under that training, they misuse it and they resort to that weapon and that option because, as you said, it's available.
Yeah, right. I think that's a good point to bring up, and now a good closing here. This is the question: the student response to arming individuals, people. I mean, we can call them teachers, but I think if we're looking at reality, we're arming people who are not trained and they don't have the time of day every day to dedicate to training, right? Both physically and mentally. You're introducing a bigger risk. And you're opening the doors to so many more problems.
Right. So to leave our listeners from my end, I want you to hopefully have a view now of my students and their position. Our urban schools, different from the suburban schools that are in the news. Because the rulings that are coming out to fix our suburban schools will apply to ours as well. And I have students who, when told there would be guns with teachers in the classroom, their immediate response was no. And we need to understand that for these students, there are enough guns in their communities, guns where they live, that when they come to school, it's the one few areas in their life where they know there shouldn't be. And if we're now going to saturate their lives with guns at home as well as school, we have to understand the ramifications that will have on a generation that is raised with that mentality. Whether guns are now a feasible option for all discourse, or just that guns are something we always have to be scared of, no matter where we go at this point. I really hope we take into consideration the damage that's going to do.
Right. Yeah, and again, to build off of what you mentioned in the previous segment, we can't exhaust this conversation. Mm-hmm. You and I could talk about this for the next 2 hours. Yeah. But I think it's a great starting point. I hope it stimulates conversation at home. We hope that you have all enjoyed, and we'll see you on the next episode.
We hope you've enjoyed what you've heard and engaging in our conversations here on Common Ground Discourse. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to us on YouTube.
You can also find us on Facebook under the same name, Common Ground Discourse. Please follow us on there. as we will be posting updates and other areas where you can find our content. Thank you.
God's peace.